Watched a segment of Good Morning Britain yesterday. I don't usually watch it, but my mum was watching it. It was on, and the TV presenter Carol Vorderman was interviewed. And she's become known recently for her strong political views. I never really had strong opinions on Carol Vorderman. I just knew her from Countdown. Not that I really watched it, but I just knew her as a TV presenter. I didn't really feel strongly about her either way. But last year, November 2023, she was dismissed from the BBC, or she stepped down. I don't know what the precise circumstances were, but regardless, she left due to debate over impartiality rules, quite similar to the Gary Lineker thing, because she has become very outspoken, particularly in her critique of the Conservative Party. It's very obvious she does not like the Tories. Now, that in itself is legitimate. There's millions of people don't like the Tories. And I don't take the view that celebrities aren't entitled to an opinion. We live in a democracy. Everyone's entitled to an opinion. But there was one particular thing that she said that I took issue with. I'll come to that in a second, but first of all, talk about the things I did agree with. She was talking about corruption in the Tory party. She was talking about Partygate and contracts, and she mentioned that as a journalist, she'd had training as a journalist and she'd done research into this sort of corruption. They're big allegations, that she would obviously need to support with facts, but I do think there's arrogance in Tory ranks. I do think there is sort of an entitlement of power there, and it was very obvious with what happened during the pandemic. And I totally share her anger with that. But there was one thing that she said, which was this government has pushed to culture wars. And it's a charge that's been levelled by others on the left against the governments collectively of Boris Johnson, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, that it's the right, the Conservatives, who are pushing the culture wars. There's no question that Conservative ministers have spoken about this. They have raised issues around, for example, defining a woman and issues like that. But I would argue that this has largely been in response to the intolerance of the woke left. And I think it's very dishonest of the left to claim that these sort of debates are something that's just invented by the right out of thin air, like there's no context. And Carol Vorderman is doing just that. It isn't the right that have come up with critical race theory and try to introduce that into seminars and nursing and teaching courses. It isn't the right who use such toxic and divisive terms as white privilege. It isn't the right who insist that trans women are just women, the same as biological women are. It isn't the right that is trying to change language in that sense. And we have seen NHS hospitals literally having notices like birth parents and people who raise children and all this sort of stuff, not raise children, excuse me, but basically reluctance to say the word mother. Now, that is absolutely woke thinking. And then you get, the byproducts of this woke ideology, such as so-called blackouts in theatres, which are basically black-only audiences are allowed, which goes against the spirit of inclusivity, which should be in the arts. I think it's a very big problem, or I think it's very misguided. If you're familiar with this, some London theatres have had blackout events whereby, particularly on subjects such as slavery, only black patrons are kind of encouraged to come along. Now, in the UK, we have anti-discrimination laws, so I wonder if a white or Asian patron came along, would they actually be turned away? If so, then the theatre should be prosecuted for breaking those laws. I think it's wholly misguided. I think the idea is to have some sort of collective black experience, but it's nonsense. It's divisive, and it's, I think, wholly misguided. But that is the sort of thing that the left promotes. So when I see left-wing people say the culture wars are just driven by the right, or another one is they really resent the term woke because it now has negative connotations, and there has been, understandably, a big backlash against it, because a lot of people are wholly fed up with the puritanical controlling thinking that lies within. But there's sort of an irony in this, because again, it isn't the right that invented the term. The term woke comes from the left. And now that they're being called out for its excesses, they say, oh, this is just something that's invented by the right. Or they'll say that's not what woke really means. It's all about compassion and understanding. But either way, I think they're making a fool of themselves when they try to defend this, because it isn't the right that invented it. The right is pushing back against it. And not just the right, incidentally. Centrists like myself push back against it because we see it for what it is. Fundamentally dishonest, controlling, pretty nasty, and very intolerant. And it's, presenting itself as the opposite. It's absurd. So with all due respect, Carol Vorderman, no, it is not the right that is waging the culture wars. True, Rishi Sunak has jibed at Starmer over issues like what defines a woman, but and maybe he's doing that too much. Maybe that will fall into Labour's hands by saying it's being petty. But there are serious issues involved in this to do with free speech and to do with how that could be legislated on. If we see, for example, new legislation that includes how trans people are referred to as some sort of hate crime, this isn't a trivial matter. It gets into freedom of conscience and freedom of speech. Those aren't trivial things. I think actually that pushing back against the woke is one of the things I find refreshing about the Conservative Party. There's a lot of things I dislike about them. I do think there is a bit of an arrogance of power there. I do think that the way they treat or the way they talk about and approach disabled claimants is abhorrent. I've spoken before about the culture in the DWP. I have a big problem with it. And I think Tory ministers like Jeremy Hunt and Mel Stride, they just reinforce that. So I'm certainly not a natural Tory, but they are the only major party, along with Reform, it has to be said, that is countering woke ideology. Now, I do have serious concerns what direction Labour will go in. Will they have more legislation dressed up as protecting minorities, but which really is shackling freedom of expression? There's already been the debates over so-called Islamophobia. Will they do the same thing with trans ideology? Will you have a situation where people are prosecuted because they insist that biology matters? I wouldn't put it past Labour to try and introduce this sort of legislation, so I am concerned about that. Lastly, Carol Vorderman was challenged on, well, look, you've got outspoken views. Some people will watch this and say, why don't you put yourself up for election? She said she doesn't want to be a constituency MP. So she's being honest, but the thing is, sooner or later people are going to say, well, look, you're very opinionated. Why don't you actually do something about it? Now, she says she's formed a tactical voting group in order to get the Tories out. She also complained when she left the BBC that she will not be silenced, like she's some sort of victim. I take the view that if you are an extremely well-paid TV presenter on a publicly funded institution like the BBC, then it isn't too much to ask to abide by some basic rules. And it's interesting that the left were talking about how important free speech was then, but their own record on free speech is far from glowing. Often they have attacked others' opinions and tried to no-platform people and censor people because they have perceived them as bigots. But, when one of their own is caught up, whether it be Gary Lineker or Carol Vorderman, then it's all about free speech. So I think it's a bit hypocritical. But basically, I'm not disagreeing with everything she's saying. I don't particularly like the Tories in every sense. But it is ridiculous to say that it is the right that is pushing the culture wars. What we've actually seen is the right pushing back. And yes, that inevitably means there is some barbs going both ways. Maybe the right engage in it a bit too much, maybe. But the notion that this is something invented by the right or invented by the Conservative Party is categorically untrue. Just how the left, or this aspect of the left, is very disingenuous about woke ideology. They make out, the likes of James O'Brien on LBC make out that it's something invented by the right. It's something that came about from the left. That's why they're very dishonest about it. Its successes are being called out when you get people who are being forced to take lectures on critical race theory, for example, in nursing colleges and teaching institutions. That's fundamentally toxic. Basically, white people are being told they have to accept that they're a horrible racist in order to pass whatever that particular course is. It's it's outrageous. It's divisive and it's wrong. Um, so the left is in no position to be talking about stirring things up because, I'm not saying the right is innocent. There's times the right may be exaggerated. There's times the right will cherry pick as well. I'm not saying the right is innocent in this regard, but I do think for the most part, it is the left that has been trying to change language. It's the left that has been trying to introduce legislation controlling language that is used. It's the left that is pushing these things more than the right. The right's not innocent, but the argument that the right have been pushing the culture war is no Carol Vorderman. It's the left that has been largely doing that. And if you refute that, how do you explain the usage of critical race theory, white privilege, militant trans ideology? These are all things that come from the left, not the right. Um, or even inherent whiteness or some of the excesses we've seen in the United States have trickled away over here. It's outrageous. So really, I think the left is in no position to talk about that.